He was a millionaire NFL star with a dream life, until one murder exposed a dark, hidden world. Fame, betrayal, and a shocking fall from grace. This is the true story of Aaron Hernandez, the athlete who threw it all away. What drove him to kill? The answers may surprise you. Aaron Hernandez was a name that once echoed across NFL stadiums with cheers and praise. A tight end for the New England Patriots, he was young, powerful, and fast, a standout on the field. At just 23 years old, he had signed a $40 million contract, a sign that his future in football was bright. But few knew that off the field, Hernandez was leading a much darker life. Behind the fame, he carried a history of aggression, paranoia, and connections that would ultimately lead to murder. Born and raised in Bristol, Connecticut, Hernandez had faced hardship early. His father, Dennis Hernandez, died suddenly when Aaron was just 16. That loss marked a turning point in his life. Friends and teachers saw change. A bright student-athlete turned moody and withdrawn. By the time he entered the University of Florida on a football scholarship, his talent was obvious. But so were the warning signs. Hernandez was involved in multiple off-field incidents, bar fights, accusations of violence, and possible links to unsolved shootings. Yet his skills overshadowed his flaws, and the Patriots drafted him in 2010. In Massachusetts, Hernandez settled in the upscale neighborhood of North Attleboro with his fiancée, Shayana Jenkins. She was in her 20s, loyal and protective, and together they had a young daughter. Their life seemed perfect to outsiders, a family, a beautiful home, and fame. But inside that home, tension brewed. One of the people frequently around their inner circle was Odin Lloyd, a 27-year-old semi-professional football player from Boston. Lloyd worked for a landscaping company and played for the Boston Bandits, a local team. He was dating Shania Jenkins, Shayana's sister, which connected him closely to Hernandez. Lloyd was described as kind, humble, and hardworking. He looked up to Hernandez and seemed to enjoy being around someone so successful. But on June 17, 2013, everything changed. That morning, Lloyd's body was found in an industrial park just minutes from Hernandez's home. He had been shot 6 times, a brutal execution. His cell phone was still on him, and one of the last people he had texted was Shania. His final message suggested he felt something was wrong. The news hit Boston hard. Why would anyone want Odin Lloyd dead? And why so close to the home of an NFL star? As investigators began looking into the murder, attention quickly turned to Aaron Hernandez. Police traced surveillance footage from his home security system. Just hours before the killing, Hernandez was seen entering his house holding a firearm. 2 men were with him, later identified as Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace. They were both friends of Hernandez, with criminal backgrounds, and often seen in his company. The footage showed them coming and going from the house around the time of Lloyd's death. Detectives soon learned that Hernandez had rented a silver Nissan Altima. That same car was spotted near the crime scene. When police searched it, they found a shell casing inside, one that matched casings found at the site where Lloyd's body was discovered. This was a critical link. The car had been returned by Hernandez the day after the murder, and his behavior during that time seemed erratic. He had destroyed the home surveillance system's hard drive, smashed his phone, and hired a cleaning crew for his house, all within hours of the crime. As these details came together, so did a clearer picture of what may have led to the murder. Hernandez, despite his fame, often carried a deep sense of mistrust. He was known to be paranoid, suspicious of those around him, and quick to anger. Some sources claimed that Hernandez believed Lloyd had been speaking to people Hernandez didn't like, or possibly knew something about his past that made him a liability. What exactly Lloyd knew or said remains unclear. But whatever it was enough for Hernandez to feel threatened. Surveillance videos from the early morning hours of June 17 showed Lloyd getting into the car with Hernandez, Ortiz, and Wallace. It appeared voluntary at first, but what followed was a drive to a remote area in North Attleboro, the industrial park where his body was found. No one else was there. No witnesses. Just 4 men, one of whom wouldn't make it back. The public reaction was immediate and shocked. An NFL star involved in a murder? It was hard to believe. The New England Patriots responded quickly, releasing Hernandez the same day he was arrested. Sponsors dropped him. Jersey sales plummeted. For many fans, it felt like betrayal, a hometown hero accused of a horrific act. Meanwhile, Shayana Jenkins found herself caught between loyalty and truth. She continued to stand by Hernandez, but her family was divided. Her sister, Shania, was devastated. She had lost her boyfriend, and now her sister's fiancé was the prime suspect. The case wasn't just a legal drama, it was tearing apart families. Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace, both present that night, were arrested and questioned. Ortiz told investigators that Hernandez was the one who pulled the trigger. Wallace denied involvement, but admitted being there. Neither man gave a full confession, but the pieces added up. Ballistics, phone records, video footage, and witness statements all pointed in the same direction. As the investigation moved forward, the story of Aaron Hernandez grew darker. What seemed like a random act of violence now appeared premeditated. Police uncovered texts between Hernandez and Lloyd arranging to meet. They found out Hernandez had been angry, distant, and possibly using drugs. There were whispers of other violent acts, past threats, and incidents that now seemed more sinister in light of the murder. The arrest of Aaron Hernandez sent shockwaves through the sports world. Just days after Odin Lloyd's body was discovered, the football star was taken into custody, charged with first-degree murder. Cameras captured the surreal moment. Hernandez, once a role model on the field, let out of his mansion in handcuffs, wearing gym shorts and a white t-shirt. The scene was broadcast across national television. To many, it felt unreal. How could a man with a multi-million-dollar career, a family, and fame be facing a murder charge? But the case against Hernandez was growing stronger by the hour. Investigators had mapped out the timeline. Odin Lloyd had left his Boston home the night of June 16th after receiving a text from Hernandez. It was a brief exchange, asking if Lloyd wanted to hang out. Lloyd got into a silver Nissan Altima with Hernandez, Carlos Ortiz, and Ernest Wallace around 2:30 a.m. Security footage later showed the car driving toward North Attleboro. Just 30 minutes later, gunshots were heard by local residents near the industrial park. Surveillance video from Hernandez's home captured more. After the car returned around 3:30 a.m., Hernandez was seen walking inside, still holding a firearm. Wallace and Ortiz appeared on the footage too. Shortly after, the group dispersed. Hernandez, instead of reporting anything unusual, began destroying evidence. He dismantled his home security system. He handed over his phone, but it was in pieces. He told a professional cleaning crew to deep clean the entire house. All this happened within hours of Lloyd's death. Police also searched the rental car that Hernandez had used. Inside, they found a key clue, a .45 caliber shell casing. Ballistics tests later confirmed it matched the bullets used to kill Odin Lloyd. Moreover, shoe prints at the scene were matched to the exact brand and size worn by Hernandez. These findings, along with cell phone data placing Hernandez near the crime scene, began to form a tight circle around him. Then came the testimony of Carlos Ortiz. During questioning, Ortiz admitted he had been with the group that night. He claimed that, after arriving at the industrial park, he turned away and moments later heard gunshots. When he looked back, he saw Hernandez holding a gun, and Lloyd was no longer alive. Ortiz didn't say much more, but his statement gave prosecutors the link they needed. Ernest Wallace also admitted to being in the car that night. Though he denied witnessing the actual shooting, he confirmed Hernandez and Lloyd had been arguing. That raised more questions. What was the motive? Why would Hernandez kill someone so close to him? The answer wasn't simple. Reports from friends suggested that Hernandez had grown increasingly paranoid in the months leading up to the murder. He often spoke of people snitching or betraying him. Some speculated that he feared Lloyd had information about past incidents, maybe even violent ones, that could ruin him. Others believed it was a control issue. Hernandez didn't want anyone questioning his authority. especially not someone in his personal circle. Text messages between Hernandez and Lloyd painted a picture of tension. Hernandez seemed frustrated, sometimes cold. Lloyd, on the other hand, appeared cautious. The last messages Lloyd sent to his girlfriend, Shania Jenkins, included the chilling line, "Just so you know," followed by a reference to being with Hernandez. It was as if Lloyd sensed something was wrong, and he was right. The emotional weight of the case began to wear on the people closest to it. Shania Jenkins, Hernandez's fiancée, was caught in a painful position. Her loyalty to Hernandez never wavered, at least publicly. But prosecutors believed she may have helped cover for him. She was indicted on perjury charges after allegedly lying to a grand jury about disposing of a box Hernandez asked her to remove from their home, a box that may have held the murder weapon. She insisted she didn't know what was inside. Meanwhile, Shania Jenkins was devastated. She had not only lost her boyfriend, but was watching her sister stand by the man accused of killing him. The Jenkins family became divided, their once close bond fractured by tragedy. As more came out about Hernandez, a pattern began to emerge. He wasn't just a football player with a temper. He had a violent history that had stayed under the radar. In 2012, a man named Alexander Bradley, once a close friend and alleged drug associate of Hernandez, claimed Hernandez had shot him in the face after an argument in a Florida nightclub. Bradley survived but lost an eye. That case didn't go to trial right away, but it revealed another side of Hernandez: impulsive, dangerous, and unpredictable. Then there were rumors about unsolved shootings in Boston. In 2014, Hernandez would be charged, though later acquitted, in connection with the 2012 double homicide of two men outside a nightclub. Prosecutors alleged he killed them after one accidentally spilled a drink on him. Though those charges didn't stick, they painted a chilling picture of a man capable of sudden, deadly violence. All the while, Hernandez sat in jail, held without bail. The NFL distanced itself. His Patriots jersey was pulled from stores. Fans burned his merchandise. Reporters dug into his past, revealing years of warning signs, fights in high school, failed drug tests in college, associations with gang members. People began asking the hard questions. How did no one see this coming? How did the Patriots not know? Or worse, did they know and look the other way? For the prosecution, the case was about justice, not only for Odin Lloyd, but for a community that had watched a local hero fall from grace. Lloyd's family sat through every court appearance. They kept his memory alive, describing him as a gentle, respectful man who didn't deserve what happened to him. His death was senseless. It shocked everyone who knew him. As Aaron Hernandez prepared to stand trial, the spotlight grew even brighter. Media outlets covered every detail. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and legal teams. On one side sat the family of Odin Lloyd, heartbroken, seeking justice. On the other, Hernandez's fiancée Shania Jenkins, standing by him despite the devastating evidence. The trial was set to determine whether the former NFL star was guilty of a calculated killing, or if there was any chance of reasonable doubt. The prosecution opened with a strong case. They laid out the timeline, the text messages, the surveillance footage, the rental car, and the shell casing. Jurors watched video clips from Hernandez's home security system, showing him holding what appeared to be a gun. They listened to testimony about how he destroyed his phone and surveillance hard drive. They heard about the shell casing found in the car and saw phone data placing Hernandez near the crime scene. Witnesses included forensic experts, law enforcement, and acquaintances of both Hernandez and Lloyd. One key piece of evidence was the tire tracks near Lloyd's body, matching the same rental car Hernandez had used. Another was the footprint at the scene, matching the sneakers he wore that night. And then there were the text messages from Lloyd just before his death, the ones where he reached out to his girlfriend, Shania Jenkins, mentioning Hernandez. Prosecutors said it was proof that Lloyd feared something was wrong and wanted someone to know who he was with. Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace were also part of the case. While neither testified at the main trial, their earlier interviews were referenced in court. Ortiz had told police he saw Hernandez with a gun just before Lloyd was killed. Wallace's presence in the car and his later behavior suggested he knew what had happened, even if he denied seeing the shooting. The defense tried to raise doubt. They argued that Hernandez had no clear motive to kill Odin Lloyd. They claimed that while Hernandez was present, someone else may have pulled the trigger. They questioned the reliability of the witnesses and suggested that Hernandez's actions after the murder, like destroying his phone and cleaning his house, were panicked, not necessarily signs of guilt. But the jury wasn't convinced. The combination of physical evidence, digital tracking, and Hernandez's behavior before and after the crime painted a picture of guilt that couldn't be ignored. On April 15, 2015, after weeks of testimony and 7 days of deliberation, the verdict was announced. Aaron Hernandez was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Odin Lloyd. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps filled the courtroom. Lloyd's family cried quietly. Hernandez showed little emotion as the judge read the sentence. It was a dramatic fall for a man who had once seemed unstoppable. In just a few short years, Hernandez had gone from NFL stardom to a convicted murderer, serving life in a Massachusetts state prison. He was transferred to the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center, a maximum security facility known for housing some of the state's most dangerous inmates. But the story didn't end there. In 2017, just days after being acquitted in a separate double murder case from 2012, a victory that many thought might lead to a possible appeal in the Lloyd case, Hernandez was found dead in his prison cell. It was the morning of April 19, 2017. He had taken his own life by hanging himself with bedsheets, using a window in his cell. He left behind notes addressed to his daughter and fiancée. He was 27 years old. News of his suicide stunned the public. Some believed he had done it as a final act of control. Others thought he had fallen into a deep depression, realizing he would never be free again. Later reports revealed that Hernandez had been suffering from CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a brain condition caused by repeated head trauma, common among football players. Doctors said his case was one of the most severe ever seen in someone his age. This discovery opened up new debates. Could his brain condition have affected his behavior? Could CTE have contributed to his violence, mood swings, and paranoia? The conversation extended beyond one man and into the broader dangers of professional football. But for the family of Odin Lloyd, these questions did not bring closure. Shania Jenkins, Odin's girlfriend and Shayana's sister, continued to speak publicly about his life and the pain of losing him. The Jenkins family never let the spotlight shift too far from the victim. They described Odin as a man who smiled often, worked hard, and loved his family. He didn't deserve what happened. Shayana Jenkins, now left to raise her daughter alone, remained largely out of the public eye following Hernandez's death. She had stood by him through the arrest, trial, and sentencing. But his suicide marked the final, tragic end to a story that had shattered her world. Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace were both later convicted on lesser charges. Ortiz pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and was sentenced to 4.5 to 7 years. Wallace was found guilty of being an accessory to murder and received a sentence of 4 to 7 years as well. Both had played roles in the events of that night, but it was Hernandez who had pulled the trigger. In the years since, Aaron Hernandez's story has been told in documentaries, books, and new specials. It remains one of the most shocking cases in sports history, not only for the crime itself, but for the man behind it. How someone with so much opportunity could make such fatal choices continues to puzzle many. This is more than a story about a fallen athlete. It's a story about trust, betrayal, and violence. About a man who seemed to have it all, but was consumed by fear, anger, and perhaps something much deeper inside his mind. And at the center of it all is a victim, Odin Lloyd, a man who was loved, respected, and taken far too soon. The case of Aaron Hernandez serves as a chilling reminder that success can't hide secrets, and that fame offers no immunity from consequences. In the end, all masks fall, and the truth always comes out. An NFL star at the peak of his career. A young mother full of promise. A shocking morning that left a nation stunned. What led Jovan Belcher to murder the woman he loved and take his own life moments later? This is the haunting true story the NFL never saw coming. It started like a dream. Jovan Belcher, born in 1987 in West Babylon, New York, was a determined, focused young man. He didn't come from money or fame, but he was smart, athletic, and deeply committed to football. Those who knew him remembered him as quiet, respectful, and ambitious. He worked hard, earned a scholarship to the University of Maine, and eventually made it to the National Football League, something many boys dream of but few achieve. In 2009, he was signed as an undrafted free agent by the Kansas City Chiefs. From there, he quickly proved his worth. As a linebacker, Belcher became known for his toughness, intelligence, and consistency on the field. By his fourth year in the NFL, he had become a regular starter. Fans respected his work ethic. Teammates liked his quiet strength. Coaches valued his discipline. Off the field, Jovan lived with his girlfriend, Cassandra Perkins. She was 22 years old, beautiful, and kind, and she came from Texas. The couple had a baby girl named Zoe, who was born in September 2012. She was just 3 months old. They lived together in a house in Kansas City, Missouri, trying to build a family while juggling the enormous demands of NFL life and new parenthood. But behind the closed doors of their home, things weren't going well. Friends and family had noticed signs of trouble between Jovan and Cassandra. Their relationship, by many accounts, was unstable. There were regular arguments, sometimes over small things, other times more serious. Parenting a newborn is hard on any couple, but the stress was especially heavy for them. Jovan was under constant pressure with his football career. Cassandra, now a full-time mother, was adjusting to life in a new city, far from her hometown, her friends, and her support system. According to those close to them, disagreements about their roles and responsibilities caused tension. Jovan was frustrated. Cassandra was often overwhelmed. They disagreed about money, childcare, and how they spent their time. Jealousy and mistrust made things worse. Sometimes Cassandra stayed out late with friends, and Jovan didn't like that. Other times, Jovan distanced himself emotionally, retreating into the demands of football. Still, from the outside, many thought they were trying to make it work. On the night of November 30th, 2012, the tension reached a breaking point. Cassandra had gone out that evening to a Trey Songz concert with some friends. It wasn't unusual, but Jovan was angry that she came home late. When she returned to their house, the two of them got into a heated argument. Voices were raised. Accusations were made. It wasn't their first fight, but it would be their last. By the next morning, things had spiraled into tragedy. On the morning of December 1st, 2012, just before 8 a.m., Jovan Belcher picked up a handgun. In their bedroom, while their infant daughter was in another room, he shot Cassandra multiple times. The gunfire rang out through the house. Also inside the home was Chanel Perkins, Cassandra's cousin, who had been staying with them. Chanel rushed to the room and found Cassandra on the floor, bleeding and gasping for air. Cassandra was still alive, but only barely. Chanel immediately called 911 and tried to help, but it was clear the wounds were fatal. Jovan stood over the woman he had just shot. Then, in a moment that was both chilling and tragic, he leaned down and kissed Cassandra on the forehead. He told Chanel he was sorry. Then he left the house, got into his black Bentley, and drove away. Jovan's next stop was the Kansas City Chiefs training facility at Arrowhead Stadium, just 5 miles away. It was now just before 8:10 a.m. As he arrived, staff at the facility were beginning their day. Among them were 3 men who had played major roles in Jovan's career and life: General Manager Scapioli, head coach Romeo Crennel, and linebackers coach Gary Gibbs. Jovan exited his car in the parking lot and asked for the 3 men. When they came out, they were stunned to see him. He was calm, but visibly emotional. Jovan told them something that left them in disbelief. He said he had just killed his girlfriend. They tried to talk to him, to keep him calm. He thanked them for everything they had done for him over the years. He expressed regret. Then, as police units pulled into the parking lot, Jovan stepped back. He pulled out the same handgun he had used earlier. The officers shouted for him to drop the weapon. His coaches pleaded with him. But in a matter of seconds, Jovan Belcher placed the gun to his head, knelt down, and pulled the trigger, taking his own life in front of the people who had helped shape his career. He was 25 years old. Back at the house, emergency responders arrived to find Cassandra Perkins with multiple gunshot wounds. She was taken to the hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead shortly after. Their daughter, Zoe, was unharmed but would never know either of her parents. News of the murder-suicide spread quickly. It sent shockwaves through the city, the Chiefs organization, and the entire National Football League. Within hours, it was being reported across national networks. A young NFL player had killed the mother of his child and then himself. The public was stunned. At first, there were no clear answers. No suicide note. No previous arrest records. No signs that anything this extreme was coming. Teammates were shocked. Jovan had never shown violent tendencies at work. He wasn't a loud or reckless man. His coaches described him as disciplined, intelligent, and quiet. But those closest to the couple knew that tension had been building for a long time. It hadn't been one fight that caused this. It was the result of months, maybe years, of unresolved conflict, stress, and inner turmoil. As investigators tried to understand what led to the violence, questions began to surface. Was this a tragic case of domestic abuse? A moment of rage? Or was something else going on beneath the surface? The next part of the story would reveal that this case was about more than one man and one moment. It opened a deeper conversation about the hidden pressures professional athletes face, especially when it comes to mental health, brain injury, and the emotional cost of playing America's most dangerous sport. But for now, the facts were devastating and clear. Jovan Belcher was dead. Cassandra Perkins was dead. And baby Zoe, just 3 months old, was suddenly an orphan. In the days that followed the tragedy, the shock had not faded. The Kansas City Chiefs prepared to play a scheduled home game against the Carolina Panthers just one day after the murder-suicide. There was debate about whether the game should go on. Some believed it would be disrespectful. Others, including team leaders and the NFL, felt that moving forward was the only choice. The team played. They won. But the victory meant little. Fans filled the stands, but the atmosphere was heavy. There were no celebrations. Players took the field with grief written on their faces. Several had been close to Jovan Belcher, had practiced beside him, laughed with him, trusted him. Others barely knew what to feel. Some mourned Cassandra. Many worried for the child left behind. No one could understand how it had come to this. Outside the stadium, questions began to mount. Media outlets covered the story from every angle. A successful athlete, a beautiful young mother, a 3-month-old baby, a luxury car, a gun, a sudden, violent end. It was the kind of story that captivated the country. But beneath the headlines, people wanted real answers. What went wrong? Police pieced together a timeline. According to their investigation, the fight between Jovan and Cassandra on the night of November 30th had begun when she returned late from the concert. It wasn't their first argument about her staying out, but this one had escalated quickly. Jovan had been drinking. They argued through the night and into the early morning. Investigators found no sign that Jovan had planned the murder, but something inside him had broken. By the time he reached for the gun, it wasn't a moment of impulse. It was a moment of complete collapse. Friends, teammates, and family began speaking out. Some described Jovan as a generous, disciplined man. Others admitted they had seen signs of stress in recent weeks. He had seemed more anxious, more distant. Some said he had been drinking more. He had visited the team psychologist just days before the murder, but he had not shown any signs of suicidal thoughts or violence. Cassandra's family was devastated. Her mother and relatives described her as loving, patient, and full of life. She had moved to Kansas City to build a future with the father of her child. She had just begun her journey as a mother. Her cousin Chanel, who witnessed the aftermath of the shooting, stayed mostly out of the public eye. The trauma of that morning would never leave her. As the investigation continued, a deeper story began to emerge, not just about a broken relationship, but about a broken system. People began to ask what role football may have played in this tragedy. Jovan Belcher had spent most of his adult life playing a high-impact, high-stress, collision-based sport. Like many NFL players, he had taken hundreds, maybe thousands, of hits to the head. In his time as a linebacker, it was part of the job. Concussions were common. So were headaches, dizziness, and mental fog. Players often ignored these symptoms. They were taught to push through pain. At the time, the NFL was already under fire for how it handled concussions. Lawsuits had been filed. Former players had begun coming forward, sharing stories of depression, memory loss, and erratic behavior. A condition called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, was becoming a key focus. CTE is a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated blows to the head. It had already been found in the brains of several former football players, many of whom had suffered emotional breakdowns, mood swings, and in some cases, had died by suicide. Jovan Belcher would not be tested for CTE until later. But even without confirmation, experts began connecting the dots. The violent outburst, the emotional breakdown, the sudden suicide. All of it fit the pattern seen in other athletes who had lived with undiagnosed CTE. As this new possibility came to light, attention shifted to how teams supported players' mental health. Did the Kansas City Chiefs know Jovan was struggling? Could more have been done? What systems were in place to help players cope with the psychological pressure of fame, money, injuries, and performance? The truth was uncomfortable. The NFL had long emphasized toughness. Mental health was rarely discussed. Depression and anxiety were treated as weaknesses. Most players didn't speak up, and even when they did, support was often minimal. Jovan's case pushed these questions to the forefront, not just because he was a player, but because he had taken someone else's life, and then his own. This wasn't just about internal pain. It was about irreversible loss. While the media examined the NFL's role, the league stayed mostly quiet. Statements were issued offering condolences. Tributes were made. But many fans, players, and commentators demanded more. More transparency. More accountability. More action. Meanwhile, the families of Jovan Belcher and Cassandra Perkins tried to make sense of what had happened. The Belcher family released a brief statement, expressing sorrow and heartbreak for both families. They asked for privacy. They were grieving not just for their son, but for what he had done. The Perkins family focused on Cassandra's memory. They spoke of her kindness, her warmth, and her devotion to her baby girl. They called for better protection for women, better mental health care for men, and better awareness of domestic violence. One of the most pressing questions became, what would happen to Zoe? Orphaned at just 3 months old, she became the center of a legal battle over custody and financial care. Both families wanted to raise her. Eventually, a judge appointed guardians and secured financial support from the NFL and the Chiefs. Jovan's estate, life insurance policies, and a special fund helped provide for Zoe's future. But the money could never replace what she had lost. As weeks turned into months, the news coverage faded. The NFL season went on. Other stories took over the headlines. But for those who had known Cassandra and Jovan, the pain remained. For the Kansas City Chiefs, the tragedy left a lasting scar. The organization reevaluated its mental health services. Quiet changes were made. Some coaches spoke more openly about checking in on players. Some teammates became more aware of each other's struggles. In the larger sports world, the incident helped push the conversation about CTE and mental health forward. It was no longer just a medical issue, it was a human one. It wasn't just about retired players, it was about young athletes, in their prime, quietly suffering. By the time the autopsy results and expert opinions began to trickle in, the question of whether Jovan Belcher had CTE became more than speculation. It became a tragic probability. But the full truth, what he felt, what he was thinking, what finally pushed him to pick up a gun, died with him that morning in a parking lot. What remained was a devastating aftermath, a shattered family, and a haunting silence that followed one of the most shocking days in NFL history. Months passed, but the questions never fully faded. In the wake of the double tragedy, investigators, doctors, lawyers, and journalists continued working through what Jovan Belcher left behind. While the facts of what had happened that morning were clear, he had killed his girlfriend, Cassandra Perkins, then driven to the Kansas City Chiefs facility and taken his own life. The deeper truth was still unraveling. One of the biggest questions remained whether Jovan had suffered from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated hits to the head. CTE cannot be diagnosed in the living. It requires post-mortem brain analysis. In 2014, nearly 2 years after the murder-suicide, doctors examined Jovan's brain. The conclusion was what many had expected. He showed signs consistent with CTE. The Belcher family had agreed to have his brain studied in the hope of learning what had gone so wrong. The findings aligned with what experts had already seen in other former NFL players who had exhibited similar patterns of behavior: mood swings, depression, paranoia, and impulsive aggression. It didn't explain everything, but it did offer a plausible explanation for the emotional instability and violent outburst that ended 2 lives and shattered many more. This discovery reignited discussions around the NFL's responsibility. By this point, lawsuits had been filed by hundreds of former players and their families against the league. They claimed the NFL had hidden information about the long-term dangers of head injuries. The league denied wrongdoing, but eventually agreed to a major settlement, over $1 billion, to compensate former players suffering from cognitive and emotional problems. Jovan's case became one of the most public examples of what CTE could look like in a young, active player. Unlike others who had struggled post-retirement, Jovan was in the middle of his career. He had started just the week before. There were no outward signs that his mind was deteriorating, and yet something inside him had clearly broken. While the science was now offering insight, the emotional fallout was still being processed by those closest to him. Cassandra's family never accepted the explanation of brain damage as a justification. To them, Jovan's actions were murder, plain and simple. Cassandra had trusted him, loved him, shared a home and a child with him. She didn't deserve what happened to her. The Perkins family remained focused on honoring her memory and raising awareness about domestic violence. Her cousin, Chanel Perkins, who had witnessed the aftermath, chose not to speak publicly. But her 911 call and testimony confirmed that Cassandra had been shot multiple times and that Jovan had shown remorse, but only after it was too late. On the legal front, there was no trial, no conviction, and no formal sentencing. Jovan Belcher had confessed in the parking lot of the Chiefs facility, telling coaches that he had done something terrible. He then took his own life moments later. In the eyes of the law, the case was closed, no one left to prosecute. But there were legal matters still to handle, particularly concerning Zoe, their daughter. A custody agreement was reached after negotiation between both families. Ultimately, Zoe was placed in the care of her maternal grandmother, Rebecca Gonzalez, who relocated to Texas to raise her. A financial arrangement was also finalized. Because Jovan was an active player at the time of his death, Zoe was entitled to his NFL benefits, including a life insurance policy, a 401k, and various trust funds established by the league. In total, it was estimated that Zoe would receive over $1 million in financial support across her childhood and early adulthood. The money was placed in a supervised trust to ensure it would be used for her care, education, and well-being. While it provided security, it was a pale substitute for what she had lost. The Kansas City Chiefs quietly moved on. In press conferences following the incident, they had expressed grief and support for both families. Internally, the team began to change the way it approached player support, especially regarding mental health. Mandatory counseling, access to psychological services, and more attention to off-field struggles became part of the program. But for many of Jovan's former teammates, the loss was too close. Some never spoke of him again. Others continued playing, carrying the weight of what had happened, perhaps wondering if they had missed the signs. For fans and the wider public, the story became part of a growing realization. The price of football can be far higher than what's seen on the field. CTE was no longer a theory. It was real, measurable, and deadly. And it was affecting men who, on the surface, looked healthy, strong, and successful. In documentaries and interviews, doctors began using Jovan's story to highlight the dangers of repeated head trauma. They explained how CTE can cause a slow deterioration in the brain, damaging the parts responsible for decision-making, emotional control, and impulse management. By the time symptoms appear, it's often too late. Still, not everyone accepted the CTE explanation without criticism. Some argued that plenty of football players never become violent. They pointed to other possible factors: stress, alcohol use, relationship problems, pride, fear, emotional immaturity. They said CTE might have been part of the story, but not the whole one. That complexity is what continues to make this case so haunting. Jovan Belcher was not a monster, but he committed a monstrous act. Cassandra Perkins did not see it coming, though she had seen warning signs. And their daughter Zoe now lives with a name that is forever tied to one of the most disturbing moments in sports history. By 2025, the NFL has taken further steps toward protecting players. Concussion protocols have improved. Mental health awareness is more accepted. Players have more access to psychological help. But critics still believe it's not enough. The league continues to face lawsuits, and new cases of CTE are discovered each year. Zoe Belcher is now a teenager. She has been raised by family who have worked to shield her from the darkest parts of the story. But one day, she will read it all. The details, the timeline, the ending. She will have to decide for herself what it means. Whether her father was a victim, a killer, or both. This is the legacy of the Jovan Belcher case. A story with no justice, no trial, and no sentence, but a lifetime of consequences. And a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous injuries are the ones no one can see. He was a rising NFL star with fame, money, and a future, until a deadly secret unraveled. When his pregnant girlfriend was gunned down in cold blood, all eyes turned to Ray Caruth. What drove him to destroy it all? The truth behind the headlines is darker than anyone imagined. Ray Caruth was a rising star in the National Football League. At just 25 years old, he had already made a name for himself as a wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers, a team based in Charlotte, North Carolina. Drafted in the first round of the 1997 NFL Draft, Caruth's professional career began with promise. Known for his athleticism and speed, he quickly caught the attention of fans and sports analysts alike. On the field, he seemed composed and driven. Off the field, however, a much different picture was forming, one that would soon become a national tragedy. In the summer of 1999, Caruth began a relationship with 24-year-old Cherika Adams, a local real estate agent also living in Charlotte. Cherika was known to be ambitious, friendly, and independent. She and Caruth met casually and began spending time together. The relationship was not long-term or stable, but it became serious enough that when Cherika discovered she was pregnant, she informed Caruth. The news was not well received. Caruth, who already had a child from a previous relationship, reportedly did not want to be a father again. According to friends and later evidence presented in court, Caruth was concerned that the pregnancy would lead to long-term child support payments. As a professional athlete, his income and public image were under constant scrutiny, and he feared both financial consequences and damage to his reputation. What could have been an opportunity to step up as a father instead became a motive to eliminate the problem entirely. Throughout the following months, Cherika continued with her pregnancy while maintaining limited contact with Caruth. Despite their disagreements, the two occasionally saw each other. By November, Cherika was nearly 8 months pregnant. She hoped Caruth might eventually accept the child and play a role in their lives. Tragically, she had no idea of the plan unfolding behind the scenes. On the evening of November 15, 1999, Caruth invited Cherika out to see a movie. She accepted, perhaps hopeful that things between them were improving. They drove separately to the theater and later left in their own vehicles. Caruth led the way in his BMW, and Cherika followed behind him in her own car. The night seemed ordinary, until it suddenly wasn't. Shortly after 12:30 a.m. on November 16th, as the two cars traveled through a quiet section of Charlotte, Caruth suddenly slowed down and stopped in front of Cherika's vehicle, forcing her to stop as well. Within moments, another car pulled up alongside hers. In that vehicle was Van Brett Watkins Sr., a man Caruth had secretly hired. Watkins was in his 40s, a known nightclub worker with a violent past. Without warning, Watkins opened fire into Cherika's car, shooting her 4 times. Despite her critical injuries, Cherika was still conscious and managed to call 911. The call, calm but urgent, would later become a key piece of evidence. On the recording, she identified Ray Caruth by name and explained what had just happened. She told the dispatcher that Ray had stopped his car in front of hers, and someone pulled up beside her and started shooting. Her clarity during that call, even in the face of overwhelming pain, would help shape the investigation that followed. Paramedics rushed Cherika to the hospital, where doctors quickly performed an emergency C-section to save her unborn son. The baby, named Chancellor Lee Adams, was born alive but suffered severe brain damage due to the lack of oxygen caused by the shooting. He would never fully recover and would require lifelong care. Cherika, meanwhile, was placed on life support. Over the next 4 weeks, she underwent multiple surgeries and gave several more statements to police. In each of them, she pointed to Caruth as the person behind the attack. Back at the crime scene and the hospital, investigators began to piece together what had happened. The circumstances were suspicious from the beginning. Caruth's sudden disappearance after the shooting raised alarms. He did not stay at the hospital, did not check in on Cherika or the baby, and did not cooperate with police. As the investigation intensified, his actions drew even more attention. Instead of answering questions, Ray Caruth vanished. By late November, Caruth was officially on the run. The FBI launched a manhunt that spanned several states. On December 15, 1999, one day after Cherika Adams succumbed to her injuries, Caruth was found hiding in the trunk of a car outside a motel in Tennessee. He had blankets, cash, and bottles of urine with him, evidence that he had been avoiding detection for days, possibly weeks. His arrest marked the turning point in the case and was broadcast widely across national news. The fall from grace was now complete. The arrest shocked not only the sports world, but the entire country. How could a professional football player, with wealth and fame, be connected to such a brutal crime? The public wanted answers, and the trial that followed promised to deliver them. As more details emerged, the case took on greater depth. It was not just a murder, it was a carefully planned plot, involving multiple people and motivated by one man's desire to avoid responsibility. 3 other men were arrested alongside Caruth: Van Brett Watkins Sr., the gunman, Michael Kennedy, the getaway driver, and Stanley Abraham, who helped organize the attack. All 3 had criminal records and were linked through their ties to Caruth. The prosecution would soon present the evidence that connected them all, while Caruth's defense team tried to create doubt about his involvement. Meanwhile, Cherika's mother, Sakura Adams, took on the responsibility of caring for baby Chancellor. The child, though severely disabled, survived against the odds. His presence added another layer of tragedy to the story. A boy born into violence, whose life would be permanently shaped by a father who tried to end it before it began. As the case moved toward trial, the nation watched closely. Ray Caruth had gone from being a first-round draft pick to a man facing charges in one of the most shocking crimes in NFL history. The arrest of Ray Caruth in mid-December 1999 marked a dramatic shift in the investigation. Found hiding in the trunk of a friend's car outside a motel in Wildersville, Tennessee, Caruth was captured just one day after Cherika Adams died from the gunshot wounds she had suffered nearly a month earlier. His capture came with a clear message. He was not just a person of interest anymore. He was the center of a murder investigation. The once celebrated NFL player was now a fugitive turned suspect in a crime that had shocked the nation. Back in Charlotte, prosecutors worked quickly to build a case. They were no longer dealing with an attempted murder, but a homicide. The death of Cherika Adams changed the legal scope, and Ray Carruth, along with 3 other men, Van Brett Watkins Sr., Michael Kennedy, and Stanley Abraham, now faced serious charges related to her killing. What prosecutors uncovered painted a dark and calculated picture. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was a planned assassination ordered by a man trying to escape fatherhood. The central piece of evidence was the 911 call Cherika made just moments after being shot. Her voice, calm and coherent despite her injuries, laid the foundation of the case. She told the dispatcher that Ray had blocked her car on a dark road and that someone had pulled up beside her and opened fire. Her statement was direct. She named Carruth as the person responsible for her ambush. That call, along with her follow-up written statements before her death, gave investigators a clear timeline and suspect. Detectives soon learned that Carruth had been in contact with Van Brett Watkins Sr., a known enforcer with a criminal history. Watkins, in his 40s, was no stranger to violence. He admitted to being hired by Carruth to carry out the shooting. According to Watkins, Carruth feared that the birth of his child with Cherika would lead to long-term financial responsibility. In his view, it was simpler to have her eliminated than to face the consequences. That reasoning, cold and self-serving, was at the heart of the prosecution's case. Further investigation revealed disturbing layers. Phone records placed Carruth in direct contact with Watkins in the days and hours before the shooting. Witnesses testified about Carruth's growing frustration with Cherika's pregnancy. Some even recalled him saying he wished she would just get rid of it. Yet she refused. Cherika wanted to have the baby. She believed it was her right and her decision. That belief, prosecutors argued, cost her life. In addition to Watkins, 2 other men were arrested for their roles. Michael Kennedy, who drove the second car used in the shooting, and Stanley Abraham, who helped coordinate parts of the plan, were both linked through phone records, surveillance, and witness accounts. Carruth, though not the trigger man, was the one who set everything in motion. The physical evidence was damning. Not only were the phone logs and witness testimonies lining up against Carruth, but his own behavior after the crime raised red flags. Instead of staying at the hospital to support Cherika or his unborn child, he vanished. He ignored calls from investigators, missed team practices, and evaded police for nearly a month. When finally found, he was hiding with cash, snacks, and supplies in the trunk of a car, a clear sign he had no intention of turning himself in. As the legal process moved forward, Carruth was denied bond. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. News outlets across the country covered the story in detail. Sports commentators expressed disbelief. How could a man with so much to lose make such a horrifying choice? The NFL distanced itself quickly. The Carolina Panthers released Carruth from the team the day after his arrest. From rising athlete to disgraced criminal, his fall had been rapid and absolute. While the case built in the courtroom, outside of it, Cherika Adams's family grieved and began the difficult journey of raising Chancellor Lee Adams. The baby, born prematurely and severely brain damaged due to the lack of oxygen during the shooting, became the emotional core of the case. Against all odds, he survived, but his condition was permanent. He was diagnosed with cerebral palsy and faced a lifetime of medical care, physical therapy, and support. His grandmother, Sakura Adams, stepped in to care for him, becoming his voice and protector. Chancellor's survival brought a different kind of attention to the case. He was the living reminder of what had been lost, a mother's life, a future stolen, and a child permanently altered by a crime he could never understand. His presence added weight to the charges and a human face to the tragedy. Every courtroom update, every headline, every photograph of Chancellor and his grandmother reminded the public that this was not just a case about a fallen athlete. It was about a young woman who had been hunted and a child who had been nearly destroyed before he took his first breath. By late 2000, the legal teams were preparing for trial. Ray Carruth faced multiple charges: conspiracy to commit murder, shooting into an occupied vehicle, and using an instrument to destroy an unborn child. The charge of first-degree murder was also on the table, carrying the possibility of the death penalty. Carruth maintained his innocence. His defense lawyers argued that while he may have made poor decisions, he did not plan or order Cherica's murder. They claimed Watkins acted alone, out of rage, not instruction. But the prosecution pushed forward with confidence. They had testimony, evidence, and motive. They had a grieving family and a child who had survived the impossible. Most of all, they had the words of a dying woman, words spoken clearly and without hesitation in her final hours. As the trial approached, the courtroom prepared to hear how fame, fear, and selfishness collided in a moment that ended one life and forever altered another. In October 2000, nearly a year after the night Cherica Adams was shot, the trial of Ray Carruth began in a Mecklenburg County courtroom in Charlotte, North Carolina. The courtroom was packed. Press, legal observers, and members of the public all waited to hear how a former NFL player came to be at the center of a murder conspiracy. The prosecution entered with a strong case, built on witness testimony, phone records, and most damning of all, the voice of the victim herself. The defense, meanwhile, faced the difficult task of separating Carruth from the violence he was accused of orchestrating. The prosecution's argument was clear and methodical. Ray Carruth had hired Van Brett Watkins Sr. to kill Cherica Adams in order to avoid paying child support and to remove the burden of fatherhood. They introduced evidence of Carruth's repeated contact with Watkins in the weeks leading up to the shooting, including phone records and witness accounts showing that the two had met multiple times. They presented statements from Cherica herself, including the 911 call where she told the dispatcher that Carruth had stopped his car in front of hers, allowing the shooter to trap her. Watkins, who had already pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, testified in court. He explained in detail how Carruth had approached him with a plan, how he had been promised money in exchange for killing Cherica, and how the ambush had been carried out. Though Watkins was not a sympathetic figure, his testimony was consistent with other evidence in the case, including physical forensic data and the accounts of co-defendants Michael Kennedy and Stanley Abraham. The defense, in contrast, tried to paint a different picture. They acknowledged that Carruth had been present at the scene, but argued that he had no knowledge of Watkins's intentions. According to the defense, Carruth panicked after the shooting but was not the mastermind. They insisted that Watkins acted alone, out of his own rage, and without Carruth's explicit direction. Defense attorneys portrayed Carruth as a man overwhelmed by pressure and fear, not a calculated killer. But Carruth's own actions in the aftermath weakened his case. His decision to flee, disappearing for nearly a month before being discovered in the trunk of a friend's car, was hard to explain away. Prosecutors highlighted his attempt to escape as proof of guilt. If he had nothing to hide, why had he run? Jurors were left to decide whether that flight was a sign of conscience or conspiracy. Throughout the trial, the presence of Chancellor Lee Adams and his grandmother, Socorro Adams, loomed large. Though Chancellor could not speak for himself, his condition told its own story. His brain damage, the result of oxygen loss from the shooting, was permanent. He could not walk or talk like other children his age. Yet every day, Socorro cared for him tirelessly. Her strength in the courtroom, her composure in interviews, and her advocacy for justice turned public sympathy firmly in her favor. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and emotional statements, the trial came to a close. The jury deliberated for several days. On January 19, 2001, the verdict was announced. Ray Carruth was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, shooting into an occupied vehicle, and using an instrument to destroy an unborn child. However, he was found not guilty of first-degree murder, a charge that would have carried the death penalty. The conspiracy conviction alone carried a heavy sentence. In March 2001, Ray Carruth was sentenced to a prison term of 18 years and 11 months to 24 years and 4 months. His co-defendants received varying sentences as well. Van Brett Watkins, the triggerman, was sentenced to a minimum of 40 years and 8 months in prison after his plea. Michael Kennedy, the getaway driver, received over 11 years. Stanley Abraham, who played a smaller role, received less time but still faced consequences. For many, the sentence brought closure. For others, particularly those who had hoped for a first-degree murder conviction, it felt like partial justice. Still, the message was clear. Carruth's fall from NFL glory had ended in a prison cell. The man who once outran defenders on the field would now serve nearly 2 decades behind bars. While Carruth disappeared from public view, Chancellor Lee Adams continued to grow. Under the care of his grandmother, he received therapy, schooling, and constant attention. His health challenges were significant, but Sakura refused to let his condition define his life. She became an advocate not just for her grandson, but for victims of domestic violence and for children born with disabilities caused by violent acts. Her resilience turned tragedy into advocacy. Over the years, Carruth's name would fade from headlines. Occasionally, interviews or documentaries would revisit the case, but for the most part, the NFL distanced itself. No team, no coach, and no player wanted to be associated with a man whose name had become synonymous with betrayal and violence. The league had faced scandals before, but Carruth's actions had set a new standard for disgrace. In October 2018, Ray Carruth was released from prison after serving 17 years and 11 months of his sentence. His release was quiet, with no press conference, no public apology, and no formal attempt at redemption. He was 44 years old, a free man, but one forever marked by the choices he made 2 decades earlier. In the time leading up to his release, he wrote a public letter to Sakura Adams, expressing remorse and stating a desire to be part of Chancellor's life. Sakura responded calmly, making it clear that Chancellor was loved, protected, and would not be exposed to further harm. Today, Chancellor Lee Adams is a young adult. Though his injuries limit what he can do physically, his presence remains powerful. He has been featured in documentaries and public appearances, always accompanied by his grandmother. Together, they represent the other side of this story, not just the crime in the courtroom, but the survival that followed. In the face of overwhelming loss, they endured. In the face of a man who tried to silence them, they refused to disappear. The case of Ray Carruth is no longer just a headline from the early 2000s. It is a story of ambition corrupted by fear, of violence rooted in selfishness, and of a community that chose justice over silence. It reminds us that fame does not excuse cruelty, and that even the most promising futures can be destroyed in a moment of cowardice. Most of all, it reminds us of the strength of those left behind, the ones who carry the burden of loss and choose, every day, to keep going.